All right, welcome to the Enlightenment. So this is obviously a pretty important lecture, and we're covering a lot of new ideas that develop around the 1700s AD. And the reason this lecture is important is because the names and the people we're going to be talking about today obviously influence their time, but their influences go all the way to our time and across the globe. And a lot of the names that I'm going to give you today are going to keep coming up over and over again. So, today we're lecturing on the Enlightenment. Then when we talk about life in the 1700s, I'll mention one of the guys. When I talk about the French Revolution, we'll mention several of them. When we get to the Industrial Revolution, we'll talk about. When we talk about Napoleon, we'll talk about them. So these names keep coming up over and over again. So yes, you need to know this information for your first quiz, but you also are going to need to know the information as it relates to all these other events for really at least the first half, not even to the second half of the semester. So just kind of keep that in mind. So where are we starting from? Well, remember last time we had kind of had to ask you that question: what do all the wars in the 20th century have in common? And there was actually an Enlightenment thinker named Immanuel Kant, right? So come on, let me set this all up for you, then we'll get to all the key words. Immanuel Kant, who at the very end of the Enlightenment, late 1700s, wrote a work called Perpetual Peace. And in it, he actually already knew the answer to that question of what all the wars in the 20th century had in common. What he realized, and this is of course before the 20th century, is what he realized is that the one thing every war has in common in the 20th century is if you look at the two sides fighting, it's what you don't see. It's not about land, it's not about a lot of people died, it's not, religion, it's not any of those things. It's that in the 20th century, you never saw two real democracies fighting each other. And when I say real democracies, just because someone has an election doesn't mean they're a democracy. I'm talking about the ideas in the Bill of Rights and free speech, free assembly, where you could say what you want to say and you don't have to worry about a mob killing you or something like that. That's what we're talking about. And when you live in societies that have that, two of those societies don't fight each other. I think of World War II, or World War I, or it's one side democracy, one side dictatorship. You do see two dictatorships fighting each other, like Iran and Iraq, as many other examples as well. But what Immanuel Kant already kind of envisioned is if you don't want to have wars in a society, you create democratic republics, essentially, what kind of we are as the United States. So this is what the Enlightenment is about, right? That it's a period of time where these thinkers are questioning the world they're living in the 1700s, and really analyzing a lot of things regarding four major areas that we're going to talk about: political, human nature, religious, and economics. So we're going to go through quite a few names here again. Once again, you're going to need to know them. Once again, just like the Scientific Revolution lecture, I highly recommend you make a chart when you're done with this, with the date, the name of the person, and what they wrote, what their ideas are, right? And again, you don't need to memorize any of the specific dates, but definitely their writings. If I give you a source, I'll buy them, whatever it is, right? So we're going to start by going through kind of the first two: human nature and political kind of go together. And so we'll kind of group a little of those together, but let me start with kind of the big political ideas that come out of the Enlightenment, and then we'll kind of work our way through the rest of this. So these are the key words for our political figures, right? And so we're going to go through them: Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, Rizzo, Paine. There are others. I'm hoping by now you've heard of these names before. And so for each one, I kind of gave you their name. I gave you a rough time period when they did most of their work. And then I gave you whatever they wrote, right? So Hobbes wrote Leviathan, Locke wrote two treatises on civil government, Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws, Rizzo, The Social Contract, and Paine, Common Sense. So we're going to go through these guys, and I think I'll probably just stay mainly on this slide. I basically have a few images of some of these individuals, but I can kind of show you that as we go through it. So we're going to start with Hobbes, and Hobbes was from England. His most important work is called Leviathan, and in it, let me just read a little bit from you. He makes an interesting idea. He basically says about individuals. He said, if two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in that way, to their end, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So one of the things about Hobbes, and one of the good tricks on this is kind of a bit of word association trick as you're taking notes. Hobbes, his view on human nature. He basically believes people are bad, that we are in, make sure you're clear what human nature means. Human nature is how we are born, right? Not what we're taught, not what we learn, just our instinct, how we're born from out of the womb. And he says basically our human nature is to be selfish, and if two people want the same thing, they're going to fight for it. He's probably right in that sense. I mean, if don't try this at home, but if you take two babies and you put them together and you give them all one toy and then you see what happens, they're probably not going to play nice, right? They're both going to fight. I have a 2-year-old, and I could tell you from the very beginning, selfish, right? That's what they are. They're babies. It's their instinct. It's survival. It's what it is, and that's how we are wired. And Hobbes believed that in people. Now, what Hobbes goes on to say in his story of Leviathan, and this is interesting, he says, therefore, the best form of government is absolutism. So right off, I want to show you that, people think, oh, all the Enlightenment thinkers, every single one of them was in favor of democratic ideals. Well, a lot were, most were, but not all of them. Hobbes actually argued, because of view of human nature, that we should create an absolute ruler because that's how you have stability in a society. So then the question is, what's wrong with Hobbes's view? And it's kind of easy. I mean, hopefully you're thinking about these things as you're going through these lectures. And Hobbes, if Hobbes is right about human nature, then the idea and people are selfish and greedy and all of that, then why would you be in favor of an absolute ruler who's obviously a human being as well and is also going to be selfish and greedy and dangerous and all those things? So that's kind of how people often kind of take Hobbes' idea and may agree with his view on human nature, but then don't necessarily agree with his conclusion of how people should rule and govern. So anyways, that's the first person I want you to know. Hobbes, know what he wrote, know his ideas, people being very animalistic. All right, the next name there is John Locke. Now, John Locke, first of all, let me talk about his view on human nature, and then we'll talk about his political views. He had an interesting view on human nature. He actually did not believe that people were born bad. Instead, he believed in this idea of tabula rasa, and that's Latin. It translates to blank slate. And he says, we're not born good, we're not born bad, we're born blank slate, and it's our lives events that influence how we end up. Again, the problem with that philosophy of tabula rasa is, again, it doesn't explain just how people react automatically, just human nature. It doesn't explain just how people behave from birth. So there's some problems with that view as well, of course, and there's no, perfect answer to any of this. There are a couple people who said, "Oh, human nature is good." Frankly, I just can't buy that one. And we'll see this as we go through the semester. And this is one of these topics that it's good. I can give you the information this way, but in an in-class atmosphere, it's even better because you could really get into these ideas of understanding human nature, behaviors. I oftentimes say human nature doesn't change, but morals and values do. And, doing the right thing, so to speak, having those values of hard work, responsibility, empathy even. These are things that oftentimes need to be taught. That it's not our nature, I think, it's like a muscle that needs to be worked. When we get to World War II, we'll get into this as well, of course. And it was amazing how easily somebody just does something, and just because a guy in a white coat tells you to do something, people just go, okay, without questioning, without thinking. And that's kind of an important part of understanding history, what we can learn from that as well. So anyways, that's a little bit about Locke human nature. I'm more concerned about Locke because of his document, Two Treatises on Civil Government, or sometimes it's called the Second Treatises on Civil Government, because here he outlines some ideas that are very powerful. And I'm going to read to you a couple quotes here, and I'm hoping they kind of jump at you pretty easily. Because one of the ideas he talks about in here is about the concept of basic rights. And these rights that he's talking about are rights of life, liberty, and property, right? These ideas of life, liberty, and property he's talking about, which sounds a little bit familiar, right? Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here's some other quotes out of Locke's work. Listen to this. He says that when the laws are created, they should not be varied in particular cases, but to have one rule for rich and one for poor, for the favorite at the court and the countryman at the plow. So again, each of these are points you want to get down. So he talks about life, liberty, property. He talks about the same law for rich and for poor. It doesn't matter. The law needs to be written the same. Next point, he says, the laws ought to be designed for no other end than ultimately the good of the people. So when you create laws, it should be about helping the people, not just a few nobles. He goes on and says, there must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people. Well, that should sound a little familiar, right? No taxation without representation. And if you read enough Locke, you'll very quickly see that a lot of our ideas that Jefferson and other of our brilliant founding fathers came up with, these men who were just giants of their age, right? They were amazing men of their time. You know, they didn't just pull this stuff out of thin air. They studied Locke. They studied some of these other names we're going to talk about here, and it really influenced them to eventually create what is the United States of America. So this is why I say it's not enough to know their names. You got to know why these people are important. Now, this is a Western civilization class. If you're taking U.S. history, you should learn these names as well. But in Western Civ, where does this really apply in great significance? Well, France, right? And what's going on in France during these years? Think of your last couple lectures, right? Absolutism. And in France, there is no checks to the power of the king. There is no taxation without representation. So if you're living in France and you're reading Locke's work, it's like, you know, things going off. Hey, wait a second, this might work better. And so Locke is very important in establishing kind of these ideas and these ideals that will eventually help bring about the French Revolution. So you definitely want to know him. All right, the third guy here you want to know is a man named Montesquieu, and he writes what is called the Spirit of the Laws. And I'm just going to read a short paragraph from here, and you'll very quickly see why he's important. Again, he is also from France, around 1750. He says the following: when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there could be no liberty. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. Were joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control, for the judge would then be the legislator. Were joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Well, you don't need to know that verbatim or anything, but what I do want you to clearly see is that this is obviously this concept of separation of power, right, guys? That's Article 1, 2, 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Again, our founding fathers read this stuff. Our founding fathers drew things from many places, right? They studied the Old Testament, they studied the New Testament, so they were very influenced by religious ideas. They studied the Greeks, they studied the Romans, they studied the Enlightenment ideas, and they put it all together and they created this amazing nation that we have. So that's Montesquieu. So again, back to a little bit of word association. Hobbes, people are animalistic. Locke, property rights. That's, you always remember, property rights, right? Montesquieu, separation of power. And again, where is this going to be important? He's from France. There is no checks and balance. There is no separation of power. And he's essentially saying, hey, guys, you know, this is better. We need this checks and balance system. So you have Montesquieu. All right, fourth guy, Rousseau. Rousseau wrote what is called the social contract. And he was one of these people who actually had a very favorable view of human nature. He thought we were born good. And to that end, he actually believed in creating a kind of more pure democracy type of governing. This is kind of the general will idea. That's kind of the key word. In other words, society should fill the general will. What is the will of the majority? And, you know, this idea of Rousseau that we're born good and we just rely on the general will is actually rare. You know, our government today is not a democracy. I hope you all know that. We're a democratic republic. We elect representatives to serve our interest. We don't just go on the majority, because our founding fathers had this idea of the tyranny of the majority, right? If you have just simple majority rule, it can lead to mob rule. It could lead to whoever's just loud, as opposed to, finding the checks and balance system, right? It takes a while to get things done in our country, and that's not an accident. This is why you need amendments. It takes a whole process to get amendments. That there aren't that many of them. That's what they wanted. It's why we have the electoral college system as well. The electoral college system was designed in part, it was designed for a couple reasons, but in part to avoid the tyranny of a majority. It was also designed to protect the smaller states. It was designed to make sure all the power is not in a handful of a few urban cities. I mean, there's reasons for this stuff. It's not just like, let's just do this. And again, it's more for a poli-sci class. Hopefully you get a good, solid, balanced view of an explanation in that. You can always, I don't spend a lot of time on this because it's a history class. I always feel free to send me an email or Zoom, whatever, if anybody wants to have further conversation, office hours, and all that. I always love talking about this stuff with students. But it is interesting what Rousseau wanted. So again, he was from France. He did bring in this idea of the social contract, more of a democratic rule, democracy, as opposed to like a democratic republic. All right, the last guy I want to mention is Thomas Paine, and we'll talk about Rousseau again for a whole other reason in a subsequent lecture. Thomas Paine, maybe you've heard of him before, right? 1775, wrote Common Sense. Notice the date. This is more for U.S. history, but I always like talking about him because I think everyone should know his name. If you ever read the Declaration of Independence, what is the Declaration of Independence? It's not just this preamble, it's the whole thing, and you should read it if you haven't read it, because the whole Declaration of Independence, it's Jefferson hitting boom, 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 point by point by point. This is our grievances. This is why we want to break away from England. It's not like we feel like it, right? And those ideas, where did Jefferson draw that from? Well, the first pamphlet that kind of did that was Common Sense. Paine was from England, moved to the United States, Pennsylvania, and he wrote this pamphlet that became incredibly popular. It was said per capita, the only other book per capita that was more created and printed in U.S. history was the Bible, because everybody had a copy of this thing at the time. And it was really just laying out, these are the reasons why we need to break away from England. So it's more for American history, but I still want to make sure you know it. So anyways, these names, all very important. Make sure you know them all, right? You'll need them for the quiz. You'll need them for the midterm. You'll need them for several lectures. So these are the key people regarding the political movements of the time. All right, so let me show you a few images. Locke, just so you know, familiar with some of these guys, right? So this is Locke. That's Baron Montesquieu, right? And there's one of Rousseau. Okay. All right, now we move on to another element of the Enlightenment, which is religious ideas. During the Enlightenment, there's a few religious ideas, one name, and then a few ideas I want you to know. So we'll start with Voltaire, also from France. And Voltaire, he was actually a playwright, wrote a bunch of stuff, but one of the things he definitely wrote about was religion. And I'm just going to read to you his quote, right? You don't need to know the name of what he wrote, but I do want you to know his idea. He says the following: "It does not require any great art or studied elocution to prove that Christians ought to tolerate one another. I will go even further and say that we ought to look upon all men as our brothers. What? Call a Turk a Jew? Yes, of course, for we're not all children of the same Father and creatures of the same God." So obviously he's talking about this, obvious great idea of religious toleration. But the key point in there is that he's not just talking about religious tolerations when he says Christians ought to tolerate one another. Well, what is he getting at? Remember, Protestant Reformation, Huguenots, Calvinists, Catholics are all fighting each other there. And in France, the Huguenots around 1750, remember, were not being treated too well. So when you talk about the French Revolution again, it's not just the political ideas. If you're a Protestant in France, someone like Voltaire appeals to you. Someone like Voltaire says, hey, yeah, you know what? He's right. We deserve this religious toleration. A lot of the things we have in our nation today, guys, we take so much for granted. There's no perfect society. There's no perfect nation. If you look for a utopia, you'll never find one. One of my favorite expressions in life is the enemy of good is perfection. In other words, that it's impossible to create a perfect society, but so many times people look for this utopia that they end up destroying the good. And it's really hard to balance everything to create a good society. It's impossible to create a perfect society, right? And I think that's always a key point to remember. So, anyways, Voltaire at least is talking about this idea of religious toleration. Uh, these other terms, deism, what is that? Well, deism is this idea of there's a God, and God created everything, but God does not get involved in anybody's lives, right? That God is sometimes described as God is a watchmaker, kind of creates everything, winds it up, lets it be. There aren't deist churches, right? If you think about it, because what's the point? If God's not involved in our lives, then, why go pray? Why do you go to church? So it is an interesting movement. It had some traction in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s. I've heard people falsely claim that a lot of our founding fathers were deists. They weren't. They were actually really religious men. There were a couple of them that may have followed it. But, if you think about this, look at our Declaration of Independence. Jefferson wrote it, influenced by a lot of other people as well. And at the core of the Declaration of Independence is that our rights come from God. If you're a deist, that doesn't make sense, right? Because you can't believe that our rights come from God if you believe God doesn't get involved in our lives. So while deism was somewhat a kind of a popular, trendy view in the 1800s by some people believe it today. It was held by some people, but not a lot of our founding fathers. But do know it and do know what it is, and that's deism. Another very important religious movement that really begins to gain some legs in the 1800s, in 17 and into the 1800s, is atheism. What is atheism? Atheism is there is no God, period, right? There is no God. There's a few people. There's a man named Baron de Halbach. You don't need to know his name, I guess, for this one. But this idea of atheism, is it important? Well, yeah, because it is going to have a very powerful influence on what? Well, maybe some of you know this, but one of the most significant ideologies that develops in the 1800s and then 1900s gets a lot of traction is, of course, communism. And one of the core characteristics of communism is atheism. We'll talk about this later in the semester. Karl Marx hated religion. He didn't want people to be religious. And we'll explain why that is a lot later on. But that was an idea. It wasn't very popular. It's not super popular today either, but there are a lot of people who are atheists. They say there just is no God. Which is kind of, we talked about this last time with the scientific revolution and the idea of creation. It takes a bit of leap of faith to believe all this is one big accident. So you have that. And therefore, you have this whole other group, it's kind of an offshoot, agnostic. What does the word agnostic mean? Well, agnostic literally comes from the Greek words not knowing. And an atheist says there is no God. An agnostic basically says, oh, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not a God. I can't say there isn't a God. I can't say there is a God. So you get agnostic. All right, so make sure you're clear on all these. Deism believes there's a God, just not involved in our lives, just a creator, did everything and let it be. Atheism says there is no God, and agnostic says, I don't know. All right, so you have them. And here is Voltaire, just one image of him. Okay, good. Next, economics. One guy, but a pretty important guy, right? And I'm hoping you've heard of him before, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, he around 1775 wrote a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations. So what is this about and why is he important? Well, first thing you have to know to understand what Adam Smith is writing about is his view on human nature. And then we'll talk about his economic view. So he believed that human nature, the way we are born, is with an inherent desire to do better, to improve our lives. That it's not taught to us. We want to live longer. We want to drive faster. If there's a hill, we want to instinctively know what's past that hill. If we get past that hill and we see an ocean, we want to instinctively know what's past that ocean, past that, mountain, past the solar system. It's just our instinct. If we go 80 miles per hour, we want to go 100 miles per hour, right? That's what he believed, that is how we are wired. And therefore, because he believed that is our human nature, His belief was that the best thing governments can do to allow society to flourish is to do nothing. So there's a term, laissez-faire. He didn't coin that term. Another man named Colbert coined the term. But it's kind of this idea of the invisible hand, that the role of government should be very minimal, that the less the government does, the more things can grow and prosper. Now, is this an influential idea? Well, of course it is. Guys, this is at the core of what capitalism is about. This is at the core of what the free market system is about. Now, is he right? Well, yeah, he is right. The less government does, the more you can do. Talk to anybody who's owned a business, right, or ran a business. My parents were working 12 hours days sometimes, trying to keep a business going. And the last thing you want is more government regulations, more hoops to jump through. It just makes it harder. So he's absolutely right that it takes, less government allows for more creation and allows capitalism, which actually creates a whole bunch of stuff. Your phones, your gadgets, everything you use, guys. That's all capitalism, guys. And that's the reality. Now, there's another reality, because I always like to give different perspective on things. Yes, it's true. Then there is no government or small government or limited government, you can create more. However, the other side of the coin is when you don't have a strong government or any government or limited government, there's also abuses. You get, 5-year-olds working in the coal mines. Because if the government does nothing, then, well, I could have a 5-year-old working in the coal mine. I could, create monopolies. I could do all these things. So that where it's going to become an issue is finding that balance, right? And that's a struggle that we deal with as a society since the beginning of capitalism, right? What kind of balance? How much free market is good? How much government control is good? How far do you go on either end? And you got to find that balance that makes the most sense for society to function well and flourish, but also not, take advantage of people and people's, life being hurt. And so that's the tricky part that we've been dealing with for a couple hundred years now, and we'll always deal with because of human nature again, right? So anyway, so Adam Smith, we'll talk about him again later on when we get to the Industrial Revolution. He's pretty important. All right, so that's the only economic person you need to know. One more term, abolitionism. So this is this is part of the Enlightenment period as well. Just know the term. What is this? Well, it means end of slavery. And it's a bit surprising to some people, not all, but slavery has basically been around since the dawn of civilization. Since civilization started, people have had slaves in some way, shape, or form. And it wasn't until the Enlightenment period that people said, hey, maybe human beings shouldn't own one another. What a concept. And that's when the movement began. It actually started heavily from religious groups like the Quakers. And then, of course, U.S. history, of course, we had a whole civil war about this. And, there's a lot of other times and places where people have dealt with it. Is slavery still around today? It is absolutely still places in the world today that have slavery. But it was, at least for the first time during the Enlightenment, when people started to talk about this abolitionist movement, or abolitionism is a big movement that starts. So just kind of obviously be familiar with that term. All right, so now the question is this. The next kind of thing we need to talk about, where does all this go? What happens with all of these ideas? So leaders in Europe in the 1700s have a choice. They could either embrace these ideas or they can poo-poo all these ideas. They could basically say, I don't care about any of this stuff. I'm just going to do my own thing. Or they could say, maybe, some of these ideas I should listen to and embrace. And by the way, before we go any further, this is where I could probably just kind of draw this here for you really easily. I got some space. This is where, again, I would highly recommend making another chart with the name of the person, a date roughly, but more importantly, their ideas, right? And, there were quite a few names I gave you, ideas, what they wrote, their documents. And so you could kind of do this for each person we had talked about, make a chart, and that'll help you review. It's a quick kind of reference. If you're taking the quiz and you get stuck, you don't have time to look up all your notes, you have a quick chart to look at. It's a good idea. So anyways, so then back to my point is, what do people do with these ideas? Well, a lot of leaders completely dismissed them. And that's what we're going to see in France. And they say, no, we're not changing. And then you get the French Revolution. However, there was this one ruler, this lady, named Catherine the Great of Russia. And Catherine the Great of Russia is sometimes known as what we call an enlightened despot. It's kind of an oxymoronic term, right? Enlightened despot. Enlightened, but a despot is like a dictator. But she's enlightened. And what that means is Catherine the Great of Russia decides not to just poo-poo all these ideas. She embraces them. So, for example, one of the things she does is create this legislative commission inside of Russia. What is the legislative commission? Well, what she decided to do is allow people from around Russia to represent their interests through delegates, and she would listen to the people. And so if the people said, hey, we need these rights or this property or this is an issue, she would actually listen to them through the legislative commission. She's still a czarina, she still rules, she's still absolute monarch, but I'm going to listen to the people. The Grand Instruction, that was a document she created, which gave people more equality in front of the law, which talked about people's property rights being protected, right? So some ideas of Locke there. She even toyed with the idea of ending serfdom. She didn't quite do it, but she did think about it and actually play with the idea of ending serfdom, which was still around in Russia, if you remember. So what doesn't happen is important because she kind of appeases people with these Enlightenment ideas. There is no revolution in Russia in the 1700s. There's going to be one later, but there's none in 1700s, and the czars continue to rule. Unlike France, for example, of course, where they were very, we're not, the Louis in France were like, we're not giving an inch, and it's going to get pretty bloody and pretty brutal. All right, so I hope that's kind of a good little overview of a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers. There are many, many others, but there are good things to think about. I also hope I threw out a few ideas for you to ponder and think about. Again, you're always welcome to, I have my office hours via, virtual office hours, and in any way you can come and see me, and email if you ever want to chat more about this stuff. Other than that, that covers all the material you need for your first quiz. And next time, we're going to get into one of our more important lectures on the first half of the semester, the French Revolution. And that's going to be quite an adventure. It's one of my favorite lectures to do, actually. So that should be a lot of fun. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.